The committee will come to order. I'd like to begin this hearing by stating the Oversight Committee's mission statement, as we do at every hearing. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know what the money Washington takes for them is being well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold the government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizens watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I'll start today by recognizing myself for a short opening statement. Today we're here to discuss the Alaska bypass mail delivery. Our goal is to see if the current bypass system is really the most cost-effective way for the Postal Service to subsidize the cost of packages for delivery to rural and outlying areas in the state of Alaska, and talk about whether it's also the most economical way for the Alaskan people. We'll also discuss a number of potential reform options for the bypass system that could provide the cost-effectiveness that the Postal Service needs and enable a greater benefit to be able to be passed along to rural Alaskans. The bypass system was first designed in 1972 as a way to save the Postal Service money and improve service to isolated villages throughout the state of Alaska. Under the system, instead of large parcel orders being processed through the normal Postal Service infrastructure, the entire process is run and managed by private air carriers throughout the state. Over the last several decades, bypass mail has evolved into the most widely used way to ship many foods and commodities to the rural areas of the state on large, several hundred-pound pallets that are shrink-wrapped. As a result, bypass mail doesn't look at all like the mail we have in the other 49 states. Under the current system, bypass orders must be at least 1,000 pounds. This differs greatly from the Postal Service policy outside of Alaska, which prohibits parcel posts weighing more than just 70 pounds. Once the 1,000-pound bypass order is placed, it's fulfilled at warehouses in Anchorage or Fairbanks, and completed orders are grouped together on any number of pallets. From there, the pallets are handed off directly to private air carriers, who are then responsible for the transportation and final delivery of the shipment. The air carriers are paid for their service based on rates set by the Department of Transportation. It's one of the last remaining vestiges of the government setting rates for airlines. The Postal Service has no control over these rates and no power to contract with more efficient service providers. It may only pay the applicable rate to each air carrier that has met certain statutory qualifications. With little power to control cost, the bypass program only covers about 30% of its cost. In the last fiscal year, the Postal Service lost more than $70 million operating the bypass system. In D.C. speak, that may not sound like a lot of money, but you multiply it over the 40 years of the program, we're talking close to $3 billion. Today's bypass mail system is tightly governed by lengthy statutes that create significant barriers for entries for new air carriers and deliberately discourage competition. The ostensible goal of this regulation is to allow air carriers to feel secure in markets and allowing them to feel comfortable in purchasing larger, more efficient aircraft without fear of being outcompeted by new, more efficient competitors. However, a November 2011 report by the IG, Inspector General of the Postal Service, has cast doubt on whether the bypass program is operating ideally for the Postal Service or for the rural Alaskan. Specifically, the IG audit concluded that the current system subsidizes the Alaskan aviation industry, is made up of shipments that would normally be non-mailable elsewhere in the nation, and appears to fail at reducing the cost of goods for rural Alaska, with the savings of the program largely diverted to a wide variety of other commercial interests within the state. Today we'll hear testimony from representatives of many of the key stakeholders in the current system: the Postal Service, the Department of Transportation, and two representatives of the Alaska aviation industry. But first, we'll hear from some of the elected representatives here in Washington from Alaska. I thank the witnesses and look forward to a spirited discussion on how we can make this important program better. I'll now recognize the distinguished ranking member, I guess is of the full committee, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The Alaska bypass program is one of the most complicated systems in the United States Postal Service, and is unfamiliar to those who have never lived or traveled to Alaska. The system was established in response to a unique local circumstance and needs. Unlike other Postal Service programs, the Bypass program exists not only to deliver packages and freight, but also to subsidize passenger air service to remote locations in Alaska. It is proper for us to examine whether the Bypass program is the most efficient way of moving packages in Alaska and whether it remains the right way to support passenger air service there. In 2011, the Postal Service Inspector General issued a white paper finding that the cost of the Alaska Bypass program exceeded the rates paid by shippers by tens of millions of dollars every year, resulting in significant annual losses to the Postal Service. The Inspector General offered recommendations to reduce the cost of and increase the revenues generated by the Bypass program to make the Postal Service responsibilities in Alaska more reasonable and consistent with its current role to provide universal service as it does in every other state. Last month, the committee voted to approve H.R. 4011, the Alaska Bypass Fair Competition Act. During our consideration of this legislation, Chairman Issa stated that the measure would encourage greater competition and bring savings to the Postal Service and rural Alaskans. However, the committee considered H.R. 4011 without first holding hearings or hearing from Alaska residents. Before the vote last month, Congressman Don Young of Alaska wrote to the committee in opposition to this legislation. He wrote that, and I quote, "The passage of H.R. 4011 will undermine successes accomplished in a quote, in the Rural Service Improvement Act of 2002. He also wrote, and I quote, "The market pressures will invite the operations of smaller, less efficient carriers and necessitate multiple stops. This will increase the operating costs of USPS, and these costs will ultimately be passed along to consumers and taxpayers." End of quote. I'm pleased that we are convening a hearing today to examine the many complexities of the Bypass program. I'm also pleased that we now have the opportunity to hear from Senator Beckich and as well as Congressman Young, since they represent the people who would be directly affected by any legislation reported by this committee. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and look forward to the testimony.
Thank you very much. And I believe the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, has an opening statement as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to associate myself with the ranking member's statements. This committee does have an obligation to protect the ratepayers of the Post Office, particularly in light of their year-over-year losses. Additionally, I side with the ranking member in saying that the earlier bill moved last month or 2 weeks ago was in fact moved specifically without a hearing. One of the reasons for that was that when the law was created, it was moved without a hearing, and it was clearly anti-competitive. Notwithstanding that, Alaskan Bypass Mail is in fact a complex system, carefully constructed as a program designed to purposely to use postal taxpayers' refund, or excuse me, sorry guys, it's designed for the purpose of having postal ratepayers' funds subsidize Alaska's aviation industry. Last year alone, that subsidy was $76 million. I make no attempt to minimize the fact that the situation in Alaska is different than the lower 48. Additionally, the situation in Alaska really does beg the question of, are there places in which universal service is required and promised and not available by road? The answer, of course, is yes. There is no question, though, that the bulk ordering system in Alaska, if it were simply done exactly the same as the lower 48, would still lose money, but it would lose very little money. If the parcel post rate were applied, the losses to the post office would be less. That is not to say that I want to end bypass mail. Just the opposite. The bill that we are going to be considering in a markup next week is designed to bring bypass mail to a 50% self-sufficiency with a 50% subsidy. Now, going from 30 to 50% shouldn't seem like a lofty goal, nor does it mean that over the coming weeks, months, or years, we're going to fix a system that should be funded by appropriations, should be funded by the FAA, should be funded by the transportation bill, but in fact is funded on the backs of ratepayers. The Postal Inspector General, though, deserves to have his recommendations considered and efficiencies found. I will give you an example of why Alaskans should be concerned. If I were to go, as I did, to Anchorage and attempt to buy a bag of potato chips, the cost of a given bag of potato chips would be $4.29 in Anchorage. Well, in Bethel, some 400 miles away, a single plane trip, which I took, the price would go to $9.99, meaning more than double, more than $5. The fact is the shipping cost under bypass mail for that trip is 35 cents. Alaskans need to understand that the prices they pay in Bethel or on remote islands often have more to do with other parts of the distribution and profiteering by people in that system. The difference between 35 cents and $1 in that bag of chips, if passed on proportionally, would take that $4.29 bag that already goes to $10 and would take it to $10.70. I'm not asking Alaskans to pick up $10.70. I'm asking them to pick up 20 cents or less of that cost. To give you an example in the lower 48, because today we will hear arguments undoubtedly that Alaska doesn't have roads. Well, here in Washington, we have roads. In Toledo, Ohio, we have roads. If you were to ship 150 pounds of goods, some 400 miles, let's say from here to Toledo, via UPS, excuse me, it would cost approximately 80 cents a pound. Well, in fact, to ship that same distance in Alaska costs less than half that. In other words, you can ship by air in Alaska cheaper than you can ship by ground in the U.S. That was not and should not have been the cost of doing business. If we go to the most efficient way of delivering this freight, called bypass mail, to Alaskans, we can save money. Witnesses today will undoubtedly argue that you will destroy passenger travel in Alaska. If that's the case, the question is, should postal ratepayers anywhere, but particularly in the lower 48, subsidize passenger traffic in Alaska, or should Alaska seek to receive, as it might well, some portion of FAA money, landing fees, or an appropriation to take care of the need for maintaining a subsidized passenger travel in Alaska? Our bill and the bill that we will consider next week deal with the ability to try to give the opportunity to be more competitive. For some reason, Alaska Air, which operates a fleet of 737-400s, a relatively old aircraft, and only recently upgraded to that, makes the case that their unique ability to haul as a preference this freight at a rate Department of Transportation sets is essential, and that if they have competition attempting to deliver this freight for the same or less, that it will somehow disrupt a carefully designed plan which is working perfectly. The American people understand this best when one puts it in perspective. To be clear, the excess capacity of these airlines is paid for by the Postal Service. More importantly, the subsidy means that every 6 years, the American ratepayer is buying a bridge to nowhere. If one were to look at the so-called bridge to nowhere in Alaska, what you discover is that, in fact, it was a bridge to provide access to an airport. I personally am not a user of the Bridge to Nowhere very often, but the level of this subsidy every 6 years rises to the cost of another one of those bridges. That's why I put forward H.R. 4011, which I believe at a minimum tries to reduce the preferences given to specific airlines carefully crafted to lock out new competition. No American understands why incumbent carriers should be in perpetuity able to have a preference over other carriers operating for at least 1 year in Alaska. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and other members will have up to 7 days to submit their opening statements for the record. We'll now recognize our first panel. We have the junior senator from Alaska, Mr. Begich, and we have the Honorable Don Young, the representative to the House from the state of Alaska. We'll start by recognizing Senator Begich.
Chairman Farenthold and of the subcommittee and subcommittee Ranking Member Lynch and Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings, thank you for the invitation that the Alaska delegation can make today in these opening remarks. And again, I look forward to the continued discussion on this issue. I would like to also submit for the record my written comments, if that's possible, Mr. Chairman.
They are already part of the record, I believe.
Thank you. As everyone knows, the Postal Service has an obligation under the Constitution to provide universal service to all areas of the nation. I'm here today to shed some light on bypass mail, a crucial system that allows the Postal Service to fulfill its universal service obligation to Alaska. I'm also here to tell you the system is not broken. Chairman Issa, I appreciate your visit to Alaska a couple of years ago. There's no doubt Alaska presents some unique challenges to the Postal Service when it comes to universal service. I want to note the hard work of the Postal Service employees put in every day to deliver Alaska mail in a timely manner. In particular, I single out Alaska's District Manager, Ron Haberman, who is testifying here today. Ron, I want to thank you for your hard work for Alaska. Bypass mail is very important to Alaska, but it also is very important for the Postal Service because it allows universal service to Alaska in the most cost-effective way possible. Before bypass mail existed, Alaskans still relied on the Postal Service to make shipments. 80% of Alaska communities are off the road system, so we are forced to ship groceries and other necessary items through the mail. When it became clear that the postal facilities couldn't handle the high volume of parcel posts, the Postal Service established bypass mail. The system relieves the Postal Service of the need to pay for staff, facilities, and equipment to process these shipments. Let me make that point very clear. Bypass mail saves the Postal Service money. The savings from using bypass mail and avoiding the cost of parcel posts are estimated to be $45 million annually. Anyone citing the cost needs to make sure that is factored into the savings. Last month, this committee approved legislation, the intent of which is to increase competition among mainland carriers that deliver bypass mail in rural hubs to supposedly save money. However, the bill will actually have the opposite effect, make the system more expensive and less effective for the Postal Service and customers. Here's why. The Rural Improvement Service Act of 2002 purposely limited competition among mainland carriers because too many carriers were providing mainland service and they didn't have an adequate share of the mainland market. The result was unreliable service for Alaskans and high operating costs for the Postal Service. The bill created an interdependent relationship between mail and passenger service to make the system more cost-effective and reliable. Remember, Alaska is the fifth the size of the continental United States and has very few roads. When you're covering that many miles, sometimes you need to kill two birds with one stone. Something to highlight, the Postal Service has not asked for the changes that Chairman Issa has proposed. Why is the Chairman pursuing changes that would increase costs for Postal Service, especially when the Postal Service has stated the current process is the most cost-effective way for it to provide service to Alaska? While the Chairman's proposal legislation might benefit air carriers that want to enter the mainland market, it would not benefit Alaskans or the Postal Service, period. Let me hit on a couple more points. Chairman Issa has argued that the system benefits businesses more than it does rural residents. Wrong again. Just to point out the issue that we responded to the AG report, or the IG report, in regards to your example on the potato chip package, it didn't incorporate fuel costs, utility costs, health care costs, housing, and wages that are much more expensive in rural Alaska. It is not as simple as drawn by the presentation. The cost of living is high in rural Alaska, plain and simple. If you charge carriers and small business more to provide goods, those expenses will simply be handed down to the communities in the form of higher grocery prices. Chairman Issa has also argued Alaskans need to pay disproportionately more for their service. This flies in the face of the Postal Service's universal service obligation. We should not have to pay for more to receive the same service as other Americans. While the committee has failed to reach a bipartisan agreement on much-needed postal reform legislation, here we are today debating proposals that would actually cost the Postal Service more money and make the system less effective. These proposals are counterproductive to the overall postal reform effort. I just participated in the Senate committee markup of the postal reform legislation. We need to stay focused on the comprehensive postal reform legislation for the sake of the Postal Service and the American people. Despite the title of this hearing, bypass mail is not broken. The system is far from it. Alaskans are open to change to make the system more effective, but I urge the committee to reject any changes that would violate universal service for Alaska or make bypass mail system more expensive for Postal Service or my constituents. Finally, I urge the committee to consult both the Alaska delegation and the Postal Service before proceeding with any proposed changes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Senator. We will now recognize Representative Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record, if it's not there, my written statement.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for this hearing, and because I have a written statement, I'm not going to use it because the Senator has covered most of the subject. I would cover my written statement, so I'll just speak from the cuff. Mr. Chairman, I will agree with one thing with the Senator is the comment of this hearing, Alaskan bypass, a broken system. I don't know where that came from. I don't know why it was used. It's not broken. It's working. It's working quite well. And as the Senator mentioned, why this proposal is before us, I don't quite and do not know for sure. Chairman Issa has a great interest, as I've said before, in legislating in my state. And he's worried about $70 million loss, supposedly, which would cost the Postal Service probably $200 million if they were to have just what we call parcel post. There's a $15 billion debt in the post office, and you're worried about $70 million that would cost $200. I don't quite understand that. That's what you call picking up peanuts when you have a forest fire in your backyard. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. When this system works, it's working well not only for the rural community, but again, I'd like to remind my colleagues very, very, very straightly, because you're reading, I see one guy up there, Mr. Clay, is on his telephone, and that deeply disturbs me as a chairman, so I would prefer that you would like to listen very carefully. Okay, all right, that's fine. That you take all the land east of the Mississippi River to the tip of Maine, to the tip of Florida, that's part of Alaska. And in that area, you got 253 congressmen and 52 senators. And you have more mileage of highway in that area, 10,000 times more than we do. There is no highways in Alaska. We do have post offices. And the people, as American citizens, have a right for universal service. Now, if we wish to do so, we'll just go back to the parcel post system. Bypass mail, people don't understand it. What it is, the products that we were going to ship parcel post don't go through the post office. That means you don't need to build more postal buildings. It means you don't have to hire any more people if you want universal services. Now, I will say the post office attempted to, in fact, eliminate parcel post in Alaska. and that was changed back to the way it should be. So we're talking about a situation here that concerns me a great deal because it doesn't make sense to have this bill, or the bill that was passed last week, moved to the House floor when it has something in it that says peanuts, when in fact it costs us money, the taxpayer money, the Postal Service money. Now, we all know that, very frankly, there was some people talking about non-competition. This is not a new subject. Mr. Chairman Issa has gone to Senator Stevens and advocated for one of his constituents to make it more competitive. The way it was written into law, and it was Senator Stevens, was in fact it's very competitive now. It's not just one, but we couldn't have everybody participating in, or you have not enough to make it work. Now, people say we're subsidizing the passengers. Now, you build me some highways, Mr. Chairman, and I'll go along with you. You give me the land back that this Congress took away from Alaska, I'll go along with you. You let us have what the statehood said, and I'll go along with you. Do you know that this Congress took 27 million acres away from the state of Alaska and hodgepodged our map so we can't build a road if we wanted to? And the IG's report, and by the way, he's full of it, I mean right up to his eyeballs, and if he's in the room, I'll say it again, when he says, in fact, the state of Alaska ought to build more roads. That's the dumbest statement I've heard in my whole life. I doubt if he's ever been to Alaska. If he has, he knows why we can't build roads. We need this for the people, in fact, in the rural areas of Alaska. We don't need to fix something that's not broken. It does work. And we use the potato chip example like we said before. You go into one of those stores, and I used to be in a little side store business in Fort Yukon before we had bypass mail, and I know what the profit margin is. It's about 1%. So let us think about this before we move this bill. 3 people versus 253 congressmen, 2 senators. Maybe we ought to really think about it. This is not good legislation. It doesn't do what it says it do. It doesn't fix a system that's not broke. It meddles, and I don't like meddling. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Young. We appreciate your testimony as well as the Senate. I know, Senator, you agreed to ask or answer some questions. Typically, when we have legislators testify, unless they are willing, we don't question them. But we do have some questions if y'all would be willing to entertain them. I'm going to yield my time to the gentleman from California to go along with the to ask his questions. You know, being from Texas, the second largest state, we are over the fact y'all are bigger than us now. So I'll yield to the gentleman from California, another large state.
I thank you. That's how this gentleman won his primary today. Senator, your statement repeatedly of the guarantee of universal service, I might note for the record that there is no such guarantee in the Constitution. However, in my visits to Alaska, both officially and unofficially, going up to Prudhoe Bay, obviously looking at bypass mail, going to Alaskan islands, I'm totally committed to the fact that unless we find other sources of revenue to provide the appropriate subsidy for reaching those islands, that the Post Office will continue to maintain bypass mail, because, as both of you alluded to, it is more efficient than taking in a bunch of parcels in 70-pound increments. You don't have an argument with me. Both the legislation that's already been passed this committee and the next legislation deal only with the question of efficiency. Now, I might ask why it is that everywhere else, companies such as Alaskan Airlines, sooner or later have to rebid, and they can lose in a rebid. But in Alaska, they're guaranteed effectively in perpetuity to have what effectively is a legislative earmark for them to get a certain amount of revenue. Senator, do you have a reason? And I understand Congressman Young said that, we're meddling and that they can't afford, I think he basically said, he couldn't afford to have additional competition. Is it additional competition that is objected to? And if that's the case, then couldn't we name a number of maximum vendors, but then allow a bid in which a vendor could lose theirs, whether it's Alaska Airlines or a smaller one?
Mr. Chairman, let me make it very clear again, and how it's operated, as you know, in 2002, I wasn't here when the original bill was done. I know Don Congressman Young can talk to it.
Senator, you would not have wanted to be sitting in the office with Ted Stevens telling me not to meddle in Alaska when I asked him why he was locking out existing carriers.
Very happy to answer your question. Mr. Chairman, the economy of scale, Alaska Airlines is a dominant player. Creates opportunities to create more efficiency and delivery of the system. I fly on those flights a lot. I know you came up one time and you went up to Prudhoe. Prudhoe is not a village, okay?
Senator, Prudhoe is where I went to look at other issues. I've been to Alaskan islands on a hydrofoil. I came up to look at bypass.
Right, and when you went up there, going out to the villages, when we have direct and we have volume players in there, and Alaska Airlines is a volume player, and I know you can have an Alaska or a representative here, you can ask more questions, but in order to do it in the economy of scale in Alaska, if you have multiple carriers, the odds they will not be able to create the business necessary to keep the prices marketable and fair to the consumer at the end of the day. Now, you may disagree with that. I come from the private sector just like you. You're much wealthier than me, and I get it. But I come from the small business world. And you always want competition, but you also have to understand this delivery system, a parcel post, and I know how you packaged up your comments when you said they put them in big 1,000 packages. Well, that's because it's more efficient. If they didn't do it that way, they would do the 70-pounders, and the post office would pay that bill and that shipping cost, and it would be passed on.
Senator, that wasn't the question. Would you be responsive to the question? And I want to be very fair to you. You came here to help us, but we're not arguing over changing the efficiencies that are in bypass mail.
Yes, you are by the conversation.
What we are talking about is excessive stops, additional port stops, if you will, of aircraft, the ability for carriers to bid to do additional work, for additional carriers to bid, and ultimately the possibility that carriers might not carry passengers but might only carry freight. These are areas we're looking at to try to wrench out $10, $20, $30 million worth of the cost of the existing bypass mail. No part of those freight shipments called bypass mail are we talking about eliminating. We're asking, can you in fact tell us that locking out potential bidders of existing Alaskan airlines that have been doing business in Alaska for more than a year continuously, locking them out of the so-called preference, tell us why that is important, that they will, in perpetuity, never have an opportunity to replace an incumbent carrier.
Again, Mr. Chairman, in all due respect.
I don't want due respect. I just want the question answered.
That's fine. There is competition in the market. New carriers can enter the system. The issue is, especially in Alaska, when you're flying in Alaska, several aspects play into it. Not only the competition that we have in Alaska, but also the safety issues and knowing Alaska pilots and knowing the Alaska flight areas. This is a part of the equation also. It's not just getting the mail there, it's also the safety of the passengers and getting mail there. There's multiple reasons. You're not going to get the answer you want from me. I understand that. We're going to disagree on this aspect of what you're proposing.
Senator, the airlines that we're talking about, the three, I understand.
I disagree with your premise, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I understand. I just want you to make sure we make the record accurate. The airlines that would be added, I think there's 3 that under this legislation, there could be more later. As far as I know, they're able to carry this same freight. They're safe enough to be able to carry. They're just locked out from the preference. Additionally, there's a, $870 per 1,000 if a plane simply lands one additional time, even if bypassing that might be efficient for carrying the mail. These are the areas we're dealing with, and I think it's important that the record be clear. Are you saying that these other 3 carriers would not be safe to carry milk or vegetables or cans of Coke?
I'm saying the safety is part of the equation, but let me just say this.
What level of safety you need for a can of Coke?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to go back and forth with you. Maybe you want to. I've seen how some of these hearings work. I operate differently in the way we have conversations. I'm not going to go back and forth with you over the same argument. I will just tell you this. The Senate has passed out of the committee in a bipartisan way a comprehensive postal reform bill that puts the postal reform on the right track with ensuring bypass mail stays in the way it is, because it's a small piece of the puzzle and does it efficiently. We have been able to balance the budget on the Postal Service and doing it the right way with the Senate bill and looking at all these issues. And bypass mail as it is today, which I will go back to my original quote, it's not broken, despite this committee hearing's title. And we were able to do it with Democrats and Republicans in a bipartisan way on the Senate side.
Thank you very much.
May I make a comment?
Sure, well, if you'd like to comment for a moment, Mr. Young, absolutely. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, you know, this is about safety and efficiency. If you open for bid, I could come in. Now, I know on the bill it says, I believe they're supposed to be operating 6 months. I think that's correct.
I think it's a year.
But a year before they can bid. But you remember, this system's been working for a period of time where each carrier now has a system by equipment, loading capability, and in fact, if you had another competitor, would he guarantee passengers back to the home base? If he just was to fly bypass mail, he'd have to raise the rates because there's no passengers. Alaska Airlines has passengers. I think that's crucially important to remember. This is about saving money and making sure that the planes are safe. Now, that may be up to the FAA, I don't know. I mean, that's something we have to think about, this system. We have not had an accident. We have delivered the mail. There hasn't been any real problems. I mean, that goes back, is it broken? Are we just looking for a problem? That's all.
And we are a little over on Mr. Ice's time, or my time, and Mr. Cummings has indicated he'd like to go to Mr. Clay first. So, Mr. Clay, you're recognized for an equal amount of time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, my friend from Maryland, the ranking member, for yielding. Senator Begich, welcome to the friendly confines of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. You know, on December 2nd, 2011, the Alaska delegation sent I.G. Williams a letter requesting the findings within the 2011 Inspector General's report. Could you elaborate on the delegation's concerns with the report?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. First off, when you look at it, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in regards to the cost, as they highlighted that 35-cent bag of chips shipping, they didn't incorporate all the other costs of that product, and therefore that is a huge gap. They also had information regarding the flights. For example, comparing 144-seat passenger planes to 36-prop passenger planes and making them equal, which is incorrect. We went through a list of items. The infrastructure costs, how was that incorporated? If I took the position, and I do, and I would love more roads, as Congressman Young said, if you suddenly say, we don't want bypass mail, then there is a substitute, parcel post. Like everyone else can get, they can drive and deliver parcel post. Well, okay, where's that road construction money, that cost factor? None of these things are put into this discussion in the IG's report. We detail that, as you noted, 2.5 pages by the delegation, which we think are legitimate issues that detail out why the system today is not broken and is efficient, is very efficient in the delivery of the system. So, as I said, on the costing, the shipping, the amount of travel, the savings, that they never incorporated. They never asked the post office, how much are they saving by not doing this? Well, it's $35 million. Well, where's that in this equation? That should be incorporated. So there are several items that we highlighted that we think should be taken into account when you're looking at this system, and that's what it is. It's not a program. not a subsidy in the sense like people like to make other programs. This is a postal delivery system. I mean, I would just venture to guess an envelope from California to D.C. costs more than an envelope going from Southern California to maybe the town across the street. But the postal cost is the same.
And I do empathize with your position, having just finished a recent trip to the North Pole. And I was in a place called Churchill, Manitoba on Hudson Bay, pretty close to the North Pole. And it was a remote town. There were no roads leading in or out. Only way there was through train service by rail or by plane. And yes, the cost of goods and services were much higher in that town. And let me move on to Representative Young. I hope you're not reading your BlackBerry, Representative.
I've never read my BlackBerry in my life. The day I turn that sucker on is the day I'm going to walk out of these halls. I'll tell you that right now.
You know, for the life of me, I cannot understand why we are having this hearing on this bill. I mean, maybe you can shed some light on it to bring in. No, I'm talking to the witness now, Mr. Chair. I'm talking to our colleague.
I really think, in all due respect to the chairman of the full committee, it was being held because Mr. Cummings and Mr. Lynch raised this point on the letter I wrote, and I do think this is why this hearing is being held. I believe the same provisions are in the major bill that was voted on, and that now we can go to the floor and say we had a hearing. I think that's the main reason. But the reality is this will inform you, I think, a little bit about the challenges we have in the state of Alaska. I would, like I said before, if you guys help me build some roads, I'll be all for it. And we have a broken infrastructure system in the lower 48. We don't have any infrastructure of any consequence in the state. Remember how many miles of road? And so we need to have universal service for the post office. The post office is losing money. There's no doubt about that. And I'm hoping the postal reform will finally solve the problem and allow them to make some money. But $70 million when it's going to cost about $200 million to do what they're losing on $70 million, to me, that's a $130 million profit. Any way you want to cut it. So I don't know.
If I still have time, yeah, I yield to the gentleman from Maryland.
The Congressman Young, the reason why we wanted to hold a hearing is so we would get a better understanding of bypass mill. I understand that there are unique situations in Alaska, and what we wanted to do is make sure we understood what we were voting on. And so, you know, as I was been listening to the discussion, I wondered, you know, we often hear in the Congress the terms picking winners and picking losers. And I'm just wondering, those carriers that are in already, have we now given them a license to be there forever? And what about others that might want to compete? I just out of curiosity. I mean, it's just a question, and I just wondered if you were on the outside looking in. I mean, how would you handle that? In other words, if you're the carrier and you want to have an opportunity to get in on the action, and I'm not saying I don't know. I'm just curious.
No, may I address that? I'm not locked into any airline's permittity as far as carrying mail, but I am locked into safety and efficiency. That's what I'm locked into.
Yeah.
And when you put up a bid now, I know I've seen some of the bids the post office puts up, and they may go for the cheapest bid. Now that's well and good for their bottom line, but that doesn't protect the person that's flying in that airplane or the lack of efficiency receiving the mail.
So if they were, if they put up the requirements of a bid were to have the level of safety and the things that you just talked about in there, your concern is, I take it, first of all, that they would likely not require those things in the bid, and even if they did, that bidders would, even if they said they were going to do it, they probably wouldn't perform to the level of safety and efficiency that you're talking about. Is that a fair statement?
That's what I'm saying, and by the way, again, I go back to the post office, they will take the cheapest bid. And that's what concerns me. They'll take the cheapest bid, and in doing so, they can jeopardize the efficiency and the safety.
Okay, Senator.
I don't think there's any way they can.
Very quickly, also inherently when you do freight, for example, freight coming out to Anchorage going, say, to Bethel or Queetluck or a small village, that goes out there full up, if it's just a straight freight liner, comes back empty, what do you think the costs are going to be? They got to pay for that. So the costs go up. That's why this combo, and people who have a combo, they can enter the market now. But you do the combo, so then it creates a more efficient system. But if you just, it's the similar problem we have with our big boat ships that come up, tote. They come up full, they go back empty because we don't have product that we're exporting back to Seattle or Tacoma. Inherently, a straight freight shipper will cost more money in the end product. Now, I know someone will argue differently, but I'm telling you, I've flown on those combi planes. Don Young has flown on those combi planes. Half freight, half people. And the reason that's done is because you got an efficiency to the system. And that's just a fact. And that's been proven by the Post Office in its analysis of savings.
Another thing, too, unless they have the aircraft available, and that's where the bid would come in, if you're thinking you're going to be able to carry this freight in a Caravan, which is a single-engine turboprop, or in a Dash 8, you're not going to meet the requirement. The efficiency goes out the door. And to my knowledge, they don't, those seeking this new competition within the state don't have any type of aircraft like that. It'll probably come, very frankly, someone leasing them from the lower 48, bringing the new aircraft in to get into the direct freight business.
Thank you very much, and we'll now recognize the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes. Mr. Collins.
Well, in the midst of all the big states discussing here, the small state of Georgia is going to yield its time to the chairman from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Well, I think the round of questioning helped us a lot in understanding that it's all about passengers. Is that correct, Representative Young, that in fact, notwithstanding everything else, this program, what is basically the current rules tie the hands of the Post Office, forcing them to give a preference to airlines who carry passengers. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct. It's forcing them to make it more efficient.
Well, let's talk.
If you fly empty, you know this, Mr. Chairman, you fly empty going back, you're going to raise that price of the potato chips up to $12 a pack.
Well, that begs the question, if the Post Office has the ability, and I'm happy to change this legislation to make it fit the model that you and the Post Office seem to want, if the Post Office has an obligation to get the lowest long-term price, does that meet your requirement?
Lowest long-term price with efficiency.
Well,
efficiency.
Well, efficiency.
And you can't be efficient if you don't haul passengers.
Well, okay, but it's all about passengers.
Well, no, it's about efficiency.
Well, you know, Don, when I went,
have passengers, you not have efficiency.
Well, when I went up to that Aleutian Island on a hydrofoil, we went up with freight and we came back without anything. We didn't bring any passengers back.
You lost money too.
Well, I didn't, but the hydrofoil, I guess, might have done that. But let's go through the arithmetic that you've been giving up until now. The $35 million, you say it would cost more to do parcel post. That's a number you're good with?
It would.
That's fine. I'm fine with that number. They lost $76 million. Had they billed parcel post rate, they would have billed over $100 million. The arithmetic is that they could raise the price $41 million, pass only on to the efficiency of the bypass mail, $41 million in discounts, and everybody walks away happy. The only problem is that's more than my bill is purporting to charge. The current cost, let's just say round numbers, it's $100 million. $100 $110 million to ship if you were shipping parcel post. And by the way, that's almost exactly the number of what it would take for this program to break even, meaning if they used bypass mail but charged parcel post rates, the Post Office would roughly break even. Now, I understand that there's, and I'll take your number, it's a good number, $35 million in savings. I believe the Post Office needs to pass on that entire $35 million that they save by not touching the mail. I'm completely in agreement with you. The problem is they pass on tens of millions of dollars of additional discount. The problem is that universal service has a price. The Alaskan who receives parcel post by air, even including discounting the bypass savings, is still paying less than a parcel post person who gets a package delivered over 1,000 miles or 800 miles or whatever in the U.S. The discount is greater currently than, in fact, is earned due to bypass. And, Senator, I believe bypass is the most efficient way. I think it can be more efficient if we allow some competition, and we could talk about ways to protect against unreasonable competition. But do you agree that bypass mail, the portion of the savings that comes from a more efficient distribution, is what should be passed on to the ratepayer, not that plus more?
I'll give just a general comment. Not seeing your numbers, and I like to see stuff written down, but let me just make it a broader.
Senator, I was taking Don Young's numbers.
Well, let me just make a broader sweep here.
You haven't seen my numbers either.
That's right. I was looking over his shoulder here, but let me get a broader. You made the comment that, you know, you'll tweak the bill to get it to where it needs to be to make it work. Well, it's working now. Now, if we want to argue the point about, for example, if you now want to change the system of universal service, in a sense of making sure it pays for itself in areas, then we should start talking about the Grand Canyon. I can start taking the list of places where it costs more to deliver that mail.
I'll tell you, on this side of the dome, I'm happy to hear you out as long as you want to talk, but I asked you a question about the level of discount. I've already said I believe bypass mail should be maintained. What I'm looking to do in this legislation is to have as much free market competition as possible. If there is an explicit subsidy for passenger, not an efficiency, but a subsidy for passenger, I want that to be measured in a way that everyone knows that it's open and transparent. But most importantly, if we can find ways to lower the cost, I want to lower the cost, because currently the discount given for bypass mail is greater than the savings versus parcel post, which it was an alternative to. Now, to be honest, we're arguing over about $20 million and 3 companies that might be able to enter the market, at least measured under this current legislation. It's not a lot of money. It's more a matter of principle that I want to make sure that the Post Office is allowed to seek the most competitive vendors. And if you want to have a discussion about what those vendors must do, and maybe they have to be in business for 5 years, that's fine. When I went up to Alaska the first time, I saw a tail dragger, gas burner. They weren't DC-3s, they were more like DC-5s, but they were cousins, big cousins of a DC-3, and those were carrying postal freight in some of the oldest planes I'd ever seen. So I've seen a lot of old ragged planes carrying postal freight. The question isn't, is Alaska a first-class airline? It is. Is Alaska an efficient carrier? I believe it is. But that's not the whole system, and that's not really what we're talking about. Chairman Young, Don Young, very quite frankly, he's always going to be a chairman to me, he made the point about those single-engine props. Well, they carry a lot of those locations. Alaska Air carries a relatively few number of locations, but a lot of freight. And as you know, small singles and light twins are carrying a lot of the freight. That's really where I suspect that some of the efficiency could be if they were to bypass a stop here or there, deliver more appropriate for the needs of freight, maybe less appropriate for the desire of passengers. That's what this discussion's about, and I hope you could ask me, will I work with you to achieve certain things, and then tell us what you want to achieve, rather than saying there's no savings here. The Post Office and the IG are going to get up after you, and they're going to say, yes, there is. I'm quite sure of that.
Mr. Chairman, I guess my comment back to you would be that we have done this work on the Senate side, I think, a fairly fair deliberation on the overall issue on the budget of the post office and trying to get a solid bill that pulls the post office in a broad, back to breaking even plus in order for it to be, to survive. Bypass mail, as we're sitting here, which I'm, to be frank with you, I'll talk bypass mail forever. But to spend this kind of amount of time on what you just claimed, $20 million issue, seems why taxpayers are more outraged with us than ever before when it's a multi-billion-dollar issue. We have a bill that we passed that dealt with bypass mail and everything else.
Senator, as far as we know, your bill didn't touch bypass mail.
Because we don't think it's broken.
And most of the
Republicans
savings,
and
most of the
Democrats.
savings came from a transfer from the post office to Medicare. It's no net savings to the unified bill.
On the overall bill, I beg to differ. Senator Coburn, who's fairly conservative, I would say, who supported the bill coming out of committee as the ranking member, I wouldn't think he'd pass a bill that, one, costs money, doesn't show savings, and doesn't solve the problem long term. He even, through the discussions we had in that committee, saw no need to modify or change bypass mail because it wasn't broken. Other elements of the post office are broken.
Well,
That's where we should spend our time.
We're getting a little beyond the scope of where we get here overall postal reform versus a more focused look at the Alaska bypass mail system. At this point, I think we do need to move on to our other witnesses, led Representative Young and
Thank you,
the
Mr.
Senator get back to work for the people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two chairmen up there. As chairman, I do appreciate the hearing. I'm still willing to sit down and talk to people about solving, if there is a problem, if there's something we can do together. But right now, you ain't broke, don't fix it.
Thank you very much. Now we'll take a short recess while the clerks set up for the next panel.